Long before cities rose and seas were charted, the land itself ruled. For early humans, every step was a negotiation with danger, every climb and river crossing a test of wit and endurance. Predators stalked silently among trees, avalanches and storms reshaped familiar terrain, and icy rivers hid death beneath fragile surfaces. Survival demanded constant vigilance, keen observation, and the wisdom to read shadows, tracks, and wind. Knowledge passed from elder to child became culture, a silent curriculum forged in frost, mud, and bone. Here, in the frozen forests and rocky valleys of prehistory, land was more perilous than the sea. Yet it was also a crucible, shaping intelligence, cooperation, and resilience. In the delicate balance between life and death, humans learned not only to endure but to understand the world around them, laying the foundations of thought, memory, and the very essence of survival. Sorry for the interruption. Where are you tuning in from? Drop it in the comments. 12,000 years before the first grain was sown, long before the Neolithic, there were the Neanderthals. They moved across the land with a cautious grace born not of elegance, but of necessity. Every step mattered. The forest, the plains, the rocky slopes were alive, and not all life was friendly. The wind could carry the scent of a predator, the rustle of leaves could signal a hidden danger, and the terrain itself could betray a careless footfall. Life was dictated entirely by survival, by the constant negotiation between body, mind, and the untamed earth beneath them. The Neanderthals hunted, not as sport, but as a ritual of necessity. They tracked the animals that fed them, reading footprints in mud, examining broken branches, following scents almost imperceptible to modern humans. Each hunt was a lesson in patience and observation. The elk that grazed in the twilight, the wild horses that thudded across open plains, the mammoth that shook the ground with every step, all demanded skill, courage, and timing. A single misstep could turn hunter into prey. Yet it was not only the animals that carried risk, the land itself was capricious. Sharp stones hidden beneath leaves could slice a foot. Narrow ledges crumbled under weight, sending a body tumbling into the shadows below. Rivers, swollen with spring thaw, threatened to sweep away those who misjudged the current. Even familiar paths were dangerous. Knowledge could save a life one day and betray it the next. Survival depended on memory, on instincts honed over countless seasons, on the quiet understanding that every movement had consequences. In the absence of written language, knowledge was shared through example and repetition. Children learned to imitate adults, to listen for the subtle sounds of approaching danger, to gauge the wind and Sunday. Every day offered lessons in observation. Every misstep was recorded silently in the minds of the group. Cooperation was essential. No individual could face the land alone. The clan moved together, sometimes scattered across hunting grounds, sometimes clustered for protection, but always aware that the next sound could herald both opportunity and death. Even the distant sea, vast and endless, seemed almost benign compared to the immediate perils of the land. Waves could crash and retreat, but the ocean did not stalk, conceal, or ambush. On land, every step brought risk. Rocks, predators, cold, and hunger were constant companions. Life demanded constant vigilance, acute awareness, and a respect for the power beneath their feet. In those early days, the land was not merely a backdrop. It was a participant, shaping thought, movement, and culture. The dawn of the hunters was the dawn of caution, the beginning of humanity's intimate, precarious relationship with the world around them. A relationship that would define survival for millennia to come. The forest was a living labyrinth, a place where light and shadow played tricks on the senses, and every sound carried meaning. For the Neanderthals, the trees were more than shelter. They were teachers, warnings, and sometimes predators in disguise. Branches groaned under their own weight, snapping suddenly and startling both hunter and prey. Roots twisted like the veins of the earth, hiding holes and crevices that could trap a foot or shatter an ankle. Even the wind had a voice, rustling through leaves to carry signals of danger or opportunity. To move through the forest required attention as sharp as the edge of a flint knife. Every step was measured, every pause deliberate. The Neanderthals learned to read the patterns of the land, the subtle shifts in soil that hinted at a predator's path, the droppings that revealed what had eaten recently, the broken branches that marked a trail. They observed the birds, the small mammals, the insects, all signs that could indicate food or threat. A rustle in the underbrush might be a deer grazing, a wolf hunting, or a venomous snake coiled and waiting. The land demanded respect, and with respect came knowledge. Heightened senses were essential. Eyes scanned constantly. Ears caught the faintest shifts in sound. Noses detected scents carried on the air. Shadows elongated in the late afternoon sun, creating illusions of cliffs where none existed, and hiding dangers where eyes thought the ground was solid. Learning the forest was a lifetime pursuit, and even the most experienced could be caught unaware. The land was unpredictable, and yet, it shaped their very existence. It dictated paths, influenced hunting strategies, and determined where they would sleep safely through the night. Even in moments of rest, the forest was not passive. Rain would turn the soil to slick mud, making every step treacherous. Snow could conceal the bones of fallen animals or the tracks of predators, erasing the clues that survival depended upon. Trees provided food in the form of nuts, berries, and edible roots, but also concealed threats. Predators could leap from concealment, and avalanches of falling branches could crush without warning. Every resource came with risk, every advantage a hidden cost. This intimate knowledge of the land created a rhythm to life. Movement was slow, deliberate, and purposeful. Silence became as important as speech. Observing the smallest details became a form of communication with the forest, a dialogue of caution, awareness, and adaptation. In this shadowed world, the Neanderthals discovered that survival was not merely about strength or courage, but about understanding, anticipating, and respecting the land. The forest was alive, and in its shadows, humans learned both their fragility and their resilience, shaping the instincts and behaviors that would carry their kind through millennia of danger and discovery. The first flames flickered like fragile stars against the darkness, a sudden brilliance that drew both awe and caution. For the Neanderthals, fire was not merely warmth, it was survival crystallized into light and heat. The discovery of its spark changed everything. Around the fire, the cold and the shadows receded. Bones that ached from the relentless hunt relaxed, and the night became less threatening. The fire offered protection from predators, a barrier of smoke and flame that made lions, wolves, and bears hesitate. It allowed meat to be cooked, roots to be softened, and calories to be transformed into energy more efficiently than raw consumption ever could. Yet fire carried its own dangers. A careless spark could ignite the forest, turning familiar paths into walls of flame, consuming everything in its path. The Neanderthals quickly learned that fire demanded respect, that it was both ally and enemy. Flames licked unpredictably, and smoke could betray their presence to predators or rival groups. Nights spent tending the fire required constant vigilance, watching for embers that could spread, listening for the roar of wind that could fan a small flame into a destructive blaze. Every moment with fire was a negotiation between benefit and risk. Fire altered behavior, reshaping how the Neanderthals moved and lived. Campsites shifted to flatter, more open clearings, where flames could be controlled. Trees were felled carefully for fuel, taking care not to disturb the balance of the surrounding forest, and water was always kept nearby, ready to smother the rogue sparks. Even in their joy, there was a deep awareness of the power they had harnessed. Fire illuminated not just the land around them but the limits of their understanding, teaching patience, discipline, and foresight. It changed social structures as well. Groups gathered more closely, sharing warmth, food, and conversation. Knowledge passed from elders to children beside the flickering light, stories and lessons taking root as surely as the flames took hold. Fire became the center of community, the marker of survival, and the source of safety in a world otherwise dictated by darkness. But the lessons it taught were hard. Burns left scars, smoke choked the unwary, and those who underestimated its power quickly learned the limits of human control over nature. The fire was both miracle and teacher. It allowed nights to be endured rather than feared, food to be transformed rather than scavenged, and groups to gather rather than scatter. It drew attention as much as it offered protection, signaling presence to eyes that watched from the shadows. In mastering fire, the Neanderthals gained a new relationship with the land. They could illuminate it, cook it, and bend its dangers to their advantage, but never escape the ever-present lesson that with every power comes peril, and with every light, shadows remain, waiting to test the vigilance of those who dare to wield it. The world transformed beneath the relentless advance of ice. Glacial sheets crept across valleys and plains, their immense weight pressing down on the earth, reshaping rivers, cliffs, and forests. For the Neanderthals, these changes were not distant phenomena to be observed in awe. They were immediate threats, demanding constant attention and adaptation. Paths that were safe one season could vanish beneath ice the next. Creeks froze solid, then swelled with meltwater, erasing familiar tracks and creating torrents that swept away the unwary. The land itself became a predator, indifferent, immense, and unforgiving. Travel grew treacherous. Rocks that had seemed stable shifted under frost, hiding cracks and sudden drops. Avalanches could thunder without warning from distant slopes, carrying ice, stone, and snow into valleys where hunters once walked. Every ridge and plateau demanded careful reconnaissance, a slow, deliberate movement measured against the unpredictability of ice and gravity. Even caves, often safe havens, were susceptible to collapse under the weight of snow and ice. The Neanderthals learned to read the subtle signs of impending danger: a creak in a frozen branch, a faint rumble in the mountainside, the patterns of snowdrifts that hinted at hollow ground beneath. The cold pressed on every aspect of life. Water froze in streams, forcing long treks to find nourishment. Plants became scarce, hiding beneath frost, leaving small, hidden roots and seeds as the only sustenance outside of meat. Prey migrated or hibernated, forcing the Neanderthals to move in patterns dictated by survival rather than choice. They learned to track not only the animals but the subtle shifts in the land that could reveal the safest routes or warn of hidden dangers. The icy wind cut across exposed skin, and frostbite claimed those who lingered too long. Shelter became a matter of life and death, whether in caves, rock overhangs, or hastily constructed windbreaks. Stone became more than a tool; it became protection. Spears, hand axes, and sharpened flints were essential not only for hunting but for extracting resources and defending against predators emboldened by scarcity. Rocks themselves could betray as easily as they could aid. Slopes littered with loose stones became traps, and a single misstep could tumble a body into sharp-edged death. Even fire, their ally, became difficult to maintain in icy winds that threatened to snuff out every spark. Yet adaptation was constant. Knowledge passed silently through observation, and skill grew from repeated encounters with danger. Children learned quickly that the world was sharper, colder, and less forgiving than any story or lesson could prepare them for. Every step, every climb, every movement across ice or stone reinforced the lesson that survival was a dialogue with the land itself. The glacial world demanded vigilance, resilience, and foresight. In this frozen crucible, the Neanderthals were forged not merely by the struggle for food or warmth, but by the understanding that the land itself could be as lethal as any predator, that ice and stone were forces to be respected, studied, and survived. The land was never empty, never silent. Beneath the canopy, across the plains, and in the shadows of rocky outcrops, predators moved with purpose, silent, patient, and deadly. Lions prowled through tall grasses, their muscles coiled beneath golden fur, eyes glinting in the low light, ears tuned to the faintest sound of movement. Bears, massive and unpredictable, roamed forests and river valleys, capable of crushing bone with a single swipe, their senses of smell and hearing unmatched. Hyenas slinked along ridges and scavenged where opportunity presented itself, their laughter a harbinger of danger, echoing through the landscape in a way that sent the heart pounding even for the most experienced hunter. For the Neanderthals, the land was alive not only with opportunity but with constant threat, and every encounter required vigilance, skill, and respect. Hunting, which offered sustenance, was also a lesson in humility. The Neanderthals tracked prey with careful observation, reading the land as one reads a book written in footprints, broken branches, and the whisper of the wind. But they knew that they themselves could become prey. A misstep could bring a silent predator upon them before they even realized it had been there. Lions and bears did not attack blindly. They waited for mistakes, for fatigue, for distraction. Even hyenas, often underestimated, displayed cunning intelligence, working in groups to ambush or harass. The Neanderthals learned to anticipate, to predict, to respect the instincts of those who shared the land. The encounters were rarely sudden. Often they began with subtle signs. A rustle in the underbrush, a low growl carried on the wind, the glint of eyes reflecting firelight or sunlight. The hunters adapted. Spears were sharpened, clubs hefted, and movements synchronized to avoid drawing attention. Silence became as crucial as speed, and patience could mean the difference between life and death. In moments when a predator circled or approached, the Neanderthals relied on instincts honed over generations, instincts written not in words but in muscle memory, learned observation, and careful study of the land and its inhabitants. Even the terrain itself contributed to danger. Rocks could be used as weapons but also as obstacles. Cliffs offered vantage points for both hunter and hunted. Forested areas provided concealment, yet concealed predators in equal measure. The land hunted alongside the animals, every crevice, shadow, and slope, a potential instrument of survival or death. In this world, every day was a negotiation with unseen intelligence, an ongoing dialogue between human and predator, hunter and hunted, land and inhabitant. The Neanderthals survived not because they were strongest or fastest, but because they understood the rhythm of the land, the cunning of its predators, and the delicate balance required to live among creatures who were as intelligent and as relentless in their own ways. Life was never guaranteed, and the land reminded them of that truth with every step, every rustle, every silent, watchful eye hidden in the shadows. Rivers wound through the land like veins of silver, offering life and sustenance, yet hiding danger beneath their seemingly placid surfaces. For the Neanderthals, water was both a necessity and a threat. Streams and rivers provided drinking water, a place to catch fish, and fertile ground where plants grew for food. But every crossing demanded vigilance, skill, and an awareness of the hidden perils that lurked beneath. Fast currents could sweep away the unwary. Whirlpools and eddies could trap legs and drag bodies under, and the riverbeds concealed jagged rocks, deep holes, and sudden drop-offs that could shatter bones. The act of crossing was never casual. Scouts would probe the banks for the safest points, feeling the flow with hands and feet, watching for subtle swirls that betrayed hidden obstacles. Children and elders were guided carefully, their safety dependent on the judgment of the experienced. Even a small miscalculation could mean injury or death. The Neanderthals learned to read the water as they read the forest, noting the change in color, the sound of rushing currents, the patterns of floating debris. Every crossing became a study of rhythm and resistance, of patience and timing, of knowing when to move and when to wait. Predators understood the rivers as well as the humans did. Crocodiles, lurking in some regions, struck with sudden violence from beneath the surface. Bears came to fish for their own sustenance, standing in the shallows with immense patience and deadly reflexes. Wolves or big cats, drawn by opportunity, observed the crossings from the banks, calculating the moments when a body might be weakened or distracted. The land, coupled with water, became an unpredictable adversary, reminding the Neanderthals that even sustenance demanded caution and respect. Yet the rivers also taught ingenuity. Stones were used to test depth and stability. Branches and logs became aids, makeshift bridges or supports against the current. Fire, when brought close to the water, could smoke out fish or deter predators lurking at the edge. Cooperation and communication were essential. Groups moved together, forming chains of hands, guiding each other across treacherous currents, ensuring no one was left behind. The river became a teacher of strategy, of timing, and of trust. Even after crossing, vigilance remained. Wet rocks could be slippery, banks could collapse, and predators might follow the scent. Every moment in or near the river demanded attention, reinforcing the lesson that the land and its watercourses were alive, unpredictable, and unyielding. For the Neanderthals, rivers were more than barriers or resources. They were living forces, testing endurance, intelligence, and unity. Mastery over the river meant survival, but even mastery carried the humbling reminder that life was always balanced on the edge of danger, that the world itself was as cunning and as relentless as any predator stalking through shadow or beneath the current. The land was vast, but not limitless, and the Neanderthals knew it. Valleys, forests, and plains carried resources, but those resources were finite, and other groups walked the same ground, hunted the same prey, and drank from the same streams. Encounters between bands were inevitable, tense affairs where survival depended as much on diplomacy and display as on strength. Territory was not a concept recorded in maps or agreed upon with words. It was lived, defended, and understood through presence, through observation, and through occasional confrontation. When one group approached the hunting grounds or water source of another, signals were exchanged. Calls, gestures, and displays of weaponry could serve as warnings or challenges. Firelight flickering through a distant cave mouth might be a signal that another clan claimed this part of the valley. A pile of stones, sharpened stakes, or a carefully left pile of bones could mark boundaries silently, yet unmistakably. The Neanderthals understood these unspoken signs. Ignoring them could provoke conflict, and conflict carried consequences measured in blood and loss. Competition for food was rarely casual. Carcasses, herds of prey, or clusters of edible plants could mean life or death during harsh seasons. Groups that wandered too close to each other risked both theft and violence. Leaders, often those who had proven themselves strongest or most cunning, emerged to assert control, coordinating defense, and deciding when to retreat or when to fight. Status was fluid but visible, enforced not by law or ideology, but by survival and the ability to command loyalty. Social hierarchy was practical, not abstract. Those who could secure safety, organize hunting, and defend resources were followed. Those who could not were left vulnerable, sometimes exiled, sometimes casualties of their own miscalculation. Encounters could escalate quickly. Weapons were simple but lethal. Spears, clubs, and stones were used with precision, and even a single well-placed strike could end a dispute permanently. Groups learned to read the tension, to interpret the stances, the shifting weight, the eye contact that signaled intent. Blood spilled on the land was both warning and memory, a reminder of the stakes for those who followed. Yet not every meeting ended in violence. Cooperation sometimes emerged where necessity demanded it. Shared hunting of large prey or joint defense against predators could temporarily align interests. But even temporary alliances were fragile, and the land itself shaped the boundaries of possibility. Valleys and rivers divided groups as surely as walls. Each clan understood its limits, the edges of its influence, and the dangers that lay beyond. In a world where survival required both caution and courage, territory was a living, breathing challenge, and the land, generous yet merciless, taught the Neanderthals that every footfall was both claim and negotiation, every encounter a balance between kin, stranger, and the relentless reality of existence. The sharp edge of stone became an extension of the Neanderthal hand, a bridge between flesh and the world's relentless challenges. Tools were more than objects. They were survival incarnate, crafted carefully from flint, obsidian, and bone. Each spear, hand axe, or scraper carried hours of observation, experience, and skill, the culmination of generations learning how to bend the rawness of the earth to human advantage. The first crude flakes allowed meat to be cut, hides to be stripped, and branches to be shaped. But as the tools evolved, so did the complexity of life and the potential for danger. Hunting became a dance of precision, where stone-tipped spears extended reach and force. A well-thrown spear could bring down prey many times the size of a hunter, yet even with skill, miscalculations were common. A slip on a rocky incline, a branch giving way beneath a foot, or the sudden charge of an injured animal could turn a tool meant for protection into a weapon against its wielder. Accidents were frequent, and injuries were not always survivable. A deep cut could fester into infection. A broken limb could mean immobility and starvation. A misjudged throw could provoke the anger of a predator rather than its submission. Tools shaped the way Neanderthals moved across the land. Rocks could be sharpened into points, but they also demanded careful handling. Tools were carried for both offense and defense, but the weight and management of equipment altered balance, slowed flight, and required constant awareness. Even the act of shaping stone was a ritual in danger. Sharp flakes flew unpredictably, capable of slicing fingers or eyes. The land itself seemed to conspire with error. Uneven terrain, amplifying risk, hiding loose stones or sudden dips that could turn a hunting expedition into calamity. Innovation brought both efficiency and vulnerability. Scrapers and knives allowed hides to be prepared for clothing or shelter, giving warmth and protection, but even these small advantages required judgment. One careless movement could sever a tendon or cut the face. Spears and axes multiplied power but demanded foresight and coordination. Group hunts relied on timing, communication, and shared trust because even a single misstep by one hunter could compromise the entire endeavor. Through it all, tools became a reflection of the land and the challenges it imposed. They were not magic, nor were they guarantees of success. They amplified human capacity but exposed human fragility. The Neanderthals learned to respect the sharpness of stone as much as the bite of predators, understanding that mastery required vigilance. In the hands of the unskilled, a spear could kill, but it could just as easily wound its wielder. Each tool carried with it lessons in balance, patience, and humility, reminders that in a world ruled by ice, stone, river, and predator, even technology was inseparable from the omnipresent danger of the land itself. The hunt was no longer a simple pursuit of food. It had become a calculated struggle against creatures that were as formidable as they were essential. Woolly mammoths, massive and unpredictable, roamed the plains like moving mountains, their tusks curved like scythes, capable of crushing anyone foolish enough to approach without respect. Aurochs thundered across the valleys, horns locked in silent defiance of any who dared encroach upon their territory. Bison moved in herds, their sheer weight and momentum capable of flattening a hunter with a single misstep. Each expedition carried the weight of risk, each strategy a test of knowledge, skill, and collective coordination. The Neanderthals approached these giants with reverence and precision. They studied their habits, their movements, the sound of footfall across frozen earth, and the patterns of grazing. Tracks left in mud and snow were read like pages in a book, revealing age, size, and potential weakness. Hunters worked as a unit, positioning themselves to channel prey toward cliffs, traps, or ambushes. Spears were sharpened, logs prepared as barricades, and every footfall measured. Yet even with meticulous planning, the prey retained the power of unpredictability. A sudden turn, a startled roar, a stampede each could undo hours of preparation, turning hunter into hunted. In these hunts, land itself became a weapon and an ally. Slopes could funnel a mammoth into a natural trap, but the same slope could become a death trap if the ground gave way beneath human feet. Rocks could be used to drive prey or defend a flank, but they could also shatter, sending shards toward those who wielded them. Rivers and frozen lakes offered opportunities to slow massive animals, but thin ice could collapse under the combined weight of hunters and quarry alike. Every terrain feature required calculation, every decision balanced life and death. Injuries were frequent and often fatal. A horn or tusk could pierce flesh and bone, leaving wounds that festered in the cold. A fall from a precipice while pursuing a fleeing bison could break limbs and end lives. Even the most experienced hunter risked mortality, yet the need for sustenance and the value of hides, meat, and marrow pushed Neanderthals to face these dangers repeatedly. Strategy evolved rapidly. Groups learned to anticipate, to adapt, to communicate silently, and to coordinate movements in a language of gestures, sounds, and shared understanding honed through survival. The hunt became a form of war, not waged for territory alone, but for life itself. Every encounter demanded courage, foresight, and respect for the power of the land and its creatures. Failure was permanent, and success was fragile, dependent on the perfect alignment of skill, observation, and timing. In this world, Neanderthals learned that survival required more than strength. It demanded intelligence, patience, and the unyielding awareness that the land, the ice, the stone, and the beasts themselves were active participants in the struggle for existence. The sky could change in an instant, turning calm landscapes into arenas of relentless danger. Storm clouds gathered over valleys, dark and swollen, and the wind shifted from a gentle whisper to a tearing force that drove snow, rain, and debris across the land. Neanderthals learned early that weather was not a background condition but a living enemy, capable of transforming familiar terrain into a trap. Snow drifts concealed ravines, avalanches tore through slopes without warning, and rivers swelled with sudden rains, washing away paths and sweeping away the unwary. Every outing required assessment, not just of prey or terrain, but of the sky above and the shifting conditions of the ground below. Shelters became essential. Natural caves offered protection from the elements, yet even these were not immune to nature's fury. Snow could block entrances, storms could flood low-lying areas, and rockfalls could collapse overhanging ceilings with deadly force. Simple structures of branches and hides provided some defense, but demanded constant maintenance, repair, and vigilance. Fires, carefully tended, offered warmth and light, but smoke could draw predators or signal rival groups, and fire alone could not repel the crushing cold or the sudden violence of a blizzard. The Neanderthals adapted their schedules and movements to the patterns of the weather, learning to read subtle cues in the clouds, the smell of the air, and the behavior of animals. These indicators could mean the difference between safety and catastrophe. Even familiar trails became perilous when storms arrived. Ice made rock faces treacherous, turning climbs into death traps. Fallen trees and hidden crevices concealed sharp rocks, and the roar of a river rising from melting snow drowned out warning sound. Animals fled the storms unpredictably, sometimes charging across paths or into camps, adding to the chaos. The Neanderthals understood that weather could be both predator and obstacle, an unpredictable force that punished miscalculation as severely as any lion or bear. Survival required flexibility, teamwork, and foresight. Groups would huddle together, sharing warmth, reinforcing shelters, and planning routes with an acute awareness of the shifting conditions. Even then, no adaptation could remove the inherent risk. Avalanches could bury hunting grounds in seconds, and a single misstep on a frozen slope could end a life. The land's violence was impartial, indiscriminate, and relentless. Through these trials, the Neanderthals learned that mastery over the environment was partial at best. The land, ice, snow, and wind were powerful forces, demanding respect and constant vigilance. Life became a negotiation with these elements, a continuous calculation of risk and reward, every shelter reinforced, every path chosen with care, and every storm survived was a lesson in humility. Weather was more than a challenge. It was an adversary whose presence shaped behavior, forged resilience, and reminded the Neanderthals that in their world, survival was earned moment by moment, and the land, even when familiar, could always strike back. The Neanderthals learned early that survival was not only threatened by the visible dangers of predators or storms, but also by what could not be seen. Living in close proximity to animals, both wild and tamed, created invisible hazards that crept silently into their bodies. A shared water source could harbor bacteria, mud carried parasites, and animal waste became a medium for microscopic killers. Every step through the landscape, every touch of fur, every cut or scrape, was a potential invitation for disease, a reminder that the land itself could harbor lethal consequences. Injuries that might have once been minor became mortal threats. A gash from a hunting spear or a slip on jagged rock could fester into infection. Swollen limbs, fever, and the aching of bones marked the unseen battle raging inside. And even the strongest Neanderthal could succumb to forces that left no trace of the struggle on the land itself. The very act of tending to a wound required caution. Tools that cut meat and stripped hides could introduce foreign pathogens, turning instruments of survival into instruments of risk. Knowledge of herbs and plant-based remedies offered some reprieve, but the margin between life and death remained narrow, and the efficacy of treatments was inconsistent at best. Close contact with animals compounded the danger. Hunters tracking game brought home meat and hides, carrying spores, parasites, and germs back to the shelter. Domestication, if it occurred, did not remove the threat. Proximity amplified it. Shared sleeping areas, warmth in the same cave, and the presence of scavengers all contributed to the invisible web of infection. Young and old were especially vulnerable. Children, curious and untested, and elders, weakened by time and injury, bore the brunt of these invisible predators. Survival depended not just on strength or skill, but on the ability to anticipate and mitigate these unseen forces. The land itself was a conduit. Mud left after rains carried pathogens into wounds. Streams, the source of vital hydration, also transported invisible killers downstream. Vegetation growing near water could harbor parasites, and rocks that seemed inert could host organisms waiting for an opening. Every layer of the environment, every step across it, carried a silent test of resilience. Through this constant threat, the Neanderthals developed a quiet vigilance. Observation of symptoms in companions, avoidance of contaminated areas, careful preparation of food, and strategic movement became part of daily life. The bones themselves, the remains of those who succumbed, silently recorded the toll of disease, fractures that never healed properly, signs of chronic infection, and the evidence of battles fought against invisible foes. Disease reshaped behavior as profoundly as predators or weather, instilling caution, fostering community care, and teaching the lesson that survival was not solely a contest with what could be seen, but with the hidden, ever-present dangers embedded in the land itself. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the world transformed. Shadows stretched across valleys and forests, masking roots, rocks, and sudden drops. Darkness descended like a heavy curtain, and with it came a new array of dangers that daylight had partially concealed. Wolves, their eyes glinting in the firelight, prowled silently along familiar trails, moving with calculated patience, drawn by the scent of Neanderthals and the promise of prey. Owls swooped through the canopy, talons extended, sensing vibrations imperceptible to human ears. Even smaller predators, foxes and wild cats, navigated the night with ease, exploiting every flaw in human perception. Neanderthals had learned to respect nightfall. Fire became more than warmth. It was a shield, a circle of light that deterred some creatures and revealed the proximity of others. The flickering flames threw shadows that danced across cave walls, teaching the untrained eye to detect movement and anticipate threat. But fire had limits. Its reach was finite, and beyond its glow, the land transformed into a labyrinth of peril. A misstep on a moss-covered stone could break an ankle. A fallen branch could trip a hunter, and the dense forest seemed to close in, disorienting even the most experienced trackers. Communication was essential. Calls, whistles, and low tones transmitted warnings, guided movement, and kept the group together. Separation in darkness could be fatal. A single lost individual risked becoming easy prey or wandering into hidden cliffs or deep river channels. Even the familiar terrain, etched into memory by daylight, became alien at night. Hills appeared steeper, rivers swelled with shadows, and trees seemed to shift and sway in the periphery of vision. Night revealed the land's hidden dangers, forcing caution, patience, and constant vigilance. Sleep, when it came, was uneasy. Groups huddled together, forming circles around fire and young, placing sentries to listen for rustling, snapping twigs, and distant howls. Every noise was assessed, every shadow interpreted. The mind remained alert, a survival mechanism honed over generations. Dreams were brief, interspersed with the memory of day's dangers and the anticipation of what might lurk in the darkness. The night was a teacher as relentless as any predator. It reminded the Neanderthals that the world was not passive, that safety was temporary, and that the land's challenges extended beyond sight. Those who adapted, who moved with awareness, who respected the power of shadows, survived to see another dawn. Those who underestimated nightfall became lessons themselves, silent markers of the constant vigilance required to exist in a world where danger did not sleep, and darkness was as treacherous as any predator stalking silently through the forest. Life for the youngest Neanderthals was a precarious balance between curiosity and danger. Every step taken by a child was a potential threat. Every climb on rock or fallen tree carried the chance of injury or worse. Streams that provided water for drinking and cooking could sweep away a small body with currents invisible to tiny hands. Muddy banks, slippery from recent rains, concealed hidden holes or sharp stones, and the forest floor was littered with roots that could trip an inexperienced foot. Even in the protective embrace of their group, the land demanded vigilance, teaching early lessons in caution through its silent, relentless hazards. Children were closely watched, their movements restricted not by discipline alone but by the constant awareness that the world itself was unrelenting. A parent's arm, strong and ready, intercepted a misstep or a tumble. Older siblings acted as guides, teaching the young ones to read the terrain, to understand the patterns of predators, and to recognize the subtle signs of danger in wind and sky. Observation became survival training, embedded into daily routines through necessity rather than choice. Play, the only reprieve from constant vigilance, was carefully monitored, its locations and activities limited to areas deemed safe, or at least safer. The mortality of youth was harsh and immediate. Disease could claim a child in days, infections from scratches or insect bites could escalate beyond treatment, and even minor accidents carried fatal potential. The Neanderthals understood this inevitability, a silent shadow that shaped both behavior and social structures. Groups adapted by fostering communal care. Infants were rarely left unattended, carried or watched constantly, their cries a signal not only of need but of vulnerability. Education in survival began almost from birth, a continuous imparting of knowledge about the land's hidden threats and the subtle signs that could mean safety or death. Crossing streams, climbing ridges, or foraging near predator tracks became structured lessons. Children learned to listen to the rustle of leaves, to sense the tremor of distant hooves, and to observe the movements of older hunters and gatherers. Each day was an accumulation of experiences, a curriculum imposed by the demands of the environment. Even the simplest acts, picking berries, gathering firewood, or following game trails, were laden with risk and required guidance. Yet despite the omnipresent danger, the land was also a teacher, shaping resilience, attentiveness, and adaptability. Those who survived childhood carried the imprint of constant awareness, an instinctual understanding of terrain, weather, and predator behavior. Each generation learned not only the skills of hunting and shelter building, but also the subtler arts of vigilance, caution, and reading the land itself. The children of the Neanderthals grew up in a world where every step mattered, every decision bore consequences, and life was defined as much by survival as by the inheritance of wisdom passed down through the careful stewardship of the living and the lessons learned from the dead. Hunger reshaped every movement, every decision, and every risk that Neanderthals faced. When the stores of meat and gathered roots dwindled, the land transformed from a place of familiar paths into a gauntlet of threats. Cliffs that had once been skirted cautiously now became unavoidable routes, and ravines that were studied and avoided in times of plenty became necessary passages to reach distant hunting grounds or patches of edible vegetation. Predator territories that had been sidestepped for generations were now crossed with grim determination, and the risk of confrontation heightened with every step. Scarcity made the land itself an adversary, turning survival into a daily negotiation with death. Groups fractured under the pressure of hunger. Competition for remaining resources forced Neanderthals to move faster, strike harder, and make decisions with the sharpness of desperation. Small miscalculations, a misplaced foot on loose stone, a misjudged river crossing could cost a life immediately. Those who once roamed freely within established territories were now pressed into unfamiliar landscapes, forced to confront hazards they had long avoided. The rhythm of movement became dictated not by preference or convenience, but by the urgent need to find sustenance before the body faltered entirely. Predators, attuned to human movement and vulnerability, became ever more dangerous. Wolves and big cats sensed weakened prey and followed the tracks of those driven into marginal zones. A hunting party carrying nothing but spears and hope could stumble into a stalking pack or a lone predator waiting in ambush. The hunt, already perilous, became a contest, not just of skill but of survival against both animal and environment. Every encounter required calculation, courage, and the ability to respond instantaneously to the unexpected. Scarcity also reshaped social dynamics within the group. Decisions about who would go farther afield, who would guard the fire, and who would care for the young became matters of life and death. Hierarchies, once subtle and flexible, hardened under pressure. The strongest or most experienced often led forays into dangerous terrain, while others followed, their trust in leadership a fragile shield against catastrophe. Even in close quarters, tension simmered as shared resources were strained, and small disputes over food could escalate into violent confrontations. Yet through these trials, adaptation emerged. Groups learned to read subtle signs of danger, to anticipate the movements of both prey and predators, and to move with caution across unfamiliar terrain. Knowledge of hidden paths, safer crossings, and the habits of wild creatures became critical. Survival was no longer a matter of chance. It was a constant calculation, a delicate balance between risk and necessity. Scarcity turned the land into a crucible, testing endurance, judgment, and resilience, and shaping the Neanderthals into a species acutely aware that the wilderness, indifferent and relentless, could claim the unwary at any moment. Death was never distant for the Neanderthals. It stalked them through the forest, waited in the shadows of cliffs, and lurked in the sudden silence of a hunting party. When a member of the group fell, whether to a predator, a fall, or disease, the survivors faced a new dilemma. The body of the dead was more than a loss. It was a risk. Shallow graves offered a measure of dignity, but they also drew attention. Scavengers and predators, guided by the scent of decay, were drawn to these resting places, turning remembrance into a test of vigilance. Even the act of tending to the dead, of pausing to honor or bury, carried danger. Every step near a fresh grave required awareness. Every rustle of leaves might signal a predator drawn by the unguarded scent of death. The first burial practices emerged slowly, almost experimentally. A child placed gently in a depression lined with leaves, a stone laid over a small mound, a handful of edible roots or animal remains offered as accompaniment. These acts were not driven by abstract belief but by instinct, a recognition of continuity and memory. The Neanderthals understood that the dead were still part of their world, even if silent. The rituals created bonds between the living and the departed, a recognition that survival was more than muscle and bone. It was memory, knowledge, and the transmission of experience. Yet the land itself remained unforgiving. Fresh graves became markers for predators. Wolves circled near burial sites, drawn by scent and sound. Bears, opportunistic and massive, could unearth shallow pits in moments, scattering remains and threatening those who approached. A group might guard the grave for hours, huddled around the fire, alert to every snap of a twig, every rustle in the underbrush, their mourning intertwined with fear. Even wind and rain altered the landscape, washing away carefully placed markers, erasing signs, and forcing repeated visits, each fraught with risk. Burial was also a lesson in stealth, timing, and cooperation. Groups learned to dig quickly, cover scent, and remain vigilant against both predators and rival humans. Silence became essential. Gestures replaced loud communication, and each movement was deliberate. Younger members observed, absorbing the protocols, the balance of respect and caution, learning that survival extended to honoring the dead without exposing the living to danger. These rituals taught lessons that extended beyond death itself. They reinforced group cohesion, instilled caution, and nurtured the instinct to respect the power of the land and the inevitability of mortality. The Neanderthals' burial grounds, scattered across valleys, caves, and sheltered clearings, became silent archives of existence. Each grave was a record of trials survived, of dangers faced, and of individuals whose lives had been interwoven with the land. The living walked among these sites with reverence and vigilance, aware that memory came at a cost. Predators, weather, and terrain continued their silent dominion. The dead rested, but the land did not. In honoring those who had fallen, the Neanderthals learned anew that survival required constant negotiation with the environment, that even remembrance was a perilous endeavor, and that the lessons of life and death were inseparable in a world ruled by both visible and invisible threats. The land was not static. It breathed, shifted, and sometimes roared with a force that no Neanderthal could tame. Earthquakes shook the ground without warning, splitting riverbeds, toppling boulders, and cracking the forest floor. Trees swayed and groaned before snapping, sending jagged timber crashing to the earth below. The familiar paths that had been etched into memory over years could vanish in an instant, replaced by fissures, rubble, or sudden drops. Even the streams, once predictable, could transform overnight as the land moved, diverting channels, swelling with new currents, and leaving familiar crossings inaccessible or treacherous. Survival depended on vigilance, adaptability, and an understanding that the very ground beneath them could betray the unprepared. Landslides swept down hillsides with terrifying speed, carrying rocks, mud, and debris that could crush everything in their path. Small groups learned to watch the soil and slopes, to note the subtle signs of shifting earth, a softened patch, a strange vibration underfoot, or the ominous sound of loose stones rolling. But nature was not always predictable, and even the most attentive could be caught off guard. Families were forced to move camps quickly, abandoning hearths and temporary shelters, sometimes losing accumulated food or tools to the avalanche of earth. These sudden changes reinforced the lesson that permanence was an illusion. The land itself dictated movement, and flexibility was essential for survival. River courses, shaped by ice melt, rainfall, and earthquakes, could reroute entirely within a season. A crossing used safely for generations could become a torrent, its hidden undercurrents dragging away a child, a pack animal, or a hunter. Pools once teeming with fish could dry up, forcing the Neanderthals to journey farther into unknown territory. The search for food, water, and shelter became a constant negotiation with the land's unpredictable temperament. Observation became crucial. Patterns in stone, sediment, and vegetation told stories of past shifts, offering clues for future survival. Even the cliffs, mountains, and valleys were not immune. Rockfalls occurred without warning, sometimes triggered by distant tremors or thawing permafrost. A single misstep could send a Neanderthal tumbling into jagged rocks below, ending life instantly. Paths that had once seemed secure demanded reassessment after every tremor. Knowledge of safer routes, of shelter locations, of the ways to read the land's subtle warning signs became an inheritance passed from elder to youth. Survival was not merely about skill in hunting or gathering, it was about understanding the dynamic nature of the environment, the ways in which the earth could shift violently beneath unsuspecting feet. These events were terrifying, yet they also shaped ingenuity. Neanderthals learned to build shelters away from unstable slopes, to store food on higher ground, and to avoid valleys prone to sudden flooding or landslides. Groups adapted, experimenting with placement, timing, and movement patterns that minimized risk. The land demanded respect, teaching that life was never guaranteed and that every day was a negotiation with forces far beyond human control. In the rhythm of tremors, slides, and shifting rivers, the Neanderthals understood that the world was alive, ever-changing, and that their survival depended on their ability to move with it, to read its subtle cues, and to respect its immense, unpredictable power. The land, already treacherous, grew stranger with the arrival of others like them, yet not quite like them. Early Homo sapiens appeared on the horizons, moving in ways both familiar and unfamiliar, carrying tools, weapons, and strategies that the Neanderthals had never encountered. Their presence shifted the balance of survival, introducing a new layer of danger and unpredictability. For the first time, the Neanderthals faced a competitor whose cunning and adaptability rivaled their own, whose patterns of hunting and settlement overlapped and sometimes conflicted with the territories that had been claimed and carefully defended for generations. Encounters were initially cautious circles of observation across rivers, valleys, and hills. Groups of Neanderthals would pause on ridgelines, watching distant figures through the mist, noting the rhythm of their movement, the shape of their tools, the behavior of their hunting dogs or domesticated animals. Suspicion was immediate. Every approach had to be considered in terms of survival. Would these newcomers bring gifts, or would they bring death? The land, already alive with predators and hazards, now carried another threat. Competition for resources escalated tensions. Hunting grounds that once seemed ample were suddenly shared, contested, or claimed outright. Water sources, berry patches, and shelters became points of negotiation, sometimes verbal, sometimes violent. Neanderthals learned that proximity could bring opportunity, but also peril. They observed the tactics of these strangers, how they coordinated hunts, how they adapted quickly to changing conditions, and how they sometimes retreated only to return stronger and more organized. Each encounter was a lesson in caution, strategy, and diplomacy. Violence became as likely as cooperation. Clashes erupted when boundaries were crossed, when game was scarce, or when young hunters ventured too close to an unfamiliar group. Spears and stones became instruments not only of survival against beasts, but against those who were human yet alien. Injuries were inflicted, and sometimes deaths, as contests over land, food, and shelter played out under the indifferent sky. Each skirmish left scars, both visible and invisible, shaping the psychology of groups and individuals alike. Memory of the dead became part of the strategy, a warning to the living. At the same time, small gestures of diplomacy emerged. Shared knowledge of dangerous terrain, subtle signs of truce, and cautious observation allowed for temporary peace. Food might be left in neutral zones, or movements timed to avoid direct conflict. The Neanderthals learned that survival was not merely about force but about understanding intentions, reading signals, and negotiating in a landscape that demanded constant attention. The land and its dangers remained, but now the presence of others added an unpredictable variable, a living threat that required both vigilance and cunning. The encounters with early Homo sapiens reshaped social dynamics. Leaders became more important, decisions more strategic, and cooperation within groups more essential. Knowledge passed from elder to youth included not only hunting techniques and terrain navigation, but also the lessons of diplomacy and tactical retreat. Adaptation was continuous. The land was no longer the only danger. The arrival of another human species transformed the familiar into a contested space, forcing the Neanderthals to reconsider their place in the world. To balance aggression with caution, and to navigate a complex landscape where survival required both strength and foresight, winter descended with ruthless authority, transforming familiar landscapes into traps of ice and snow. Rivers that had been crossed with relative ease during warmer months became treacherous, their surfaces slick and unstable, hiding jagged rocks and deadly currents beneath frozen shells. A single misstep on brittle ice could fracture a leg, sweep a hunter into the freezing water, or force a desperate scramble that ended in injury or death. Even shallow streams froze unpredictably, masking hidden depths, and currents that had guided fish and provided fresh water now threatened to betray those who relied on them. Every crossing demanded careful observation, testing both nerve and experience, and yet necessity often outweighed caution. Slopes once gentle now became cliffs of ice, each step a negotiation with gravity and temperature. Snow obscured the edges of ravines, buried fallen trees, and softened the contours of rocks that the Neanderthals had memorized over years of passage. Paths that were familiar could vanish beneath a blanket of white, leaving hunters and gatherers to navigate by intuition and memory alone. The wind sliced across open plains with bone-deep cold, carrying flakes of ice that stung exposed skin, chilling bodies and slowing movement. Frostbite became a constant threat. especially for the young and the elderly, who were less able to withstand the bitter conditions. Survival required patience and strategy, careful pacing and an acute awareness of subtle signs, the hollow crunch beneath a foot that suggested thin ice, the way snow accumulated against rocks indicating potential avalanches, the wind shifts that hinted at approaching storms. Shelters offered some protection, but the cold itself was an adversary. Fires had to be maintained constantly, their smoke both shield and hazard. The warmth that saved a body from hypothermia also attracted predators and scavengers. Wolves drawn by the scent of cooking meat, bears roused from hibernation, and rival humans tracking movement along familiar corridors. Food became scarce, the hunted animals moving to more sheltered areas or succumbing to the cold before Neanderthals could reach them. Hunting strategies had to adapt, traps were set for longer durations, and parties moved slowly to conserve energy while maximizing the chance of success. The balance between exposure and necessity was delicate, and errors were punished immediately. Snow-covered cliffs and frozen forests forced Neanderthals to observe more closely, to learn the subtle language of winter terrain. Footprints in the snow revealed predators and prey alike. Ice fractures suggested unstable surfaces, and the patterns of snowfall warned of avalanches. The cold imposed a rhythm of life dictated by survival rather than exploration or play. Movement slowed, observation sharpened, and the smallest mistakes carried outsized consequences. Even foraging for roots or firewood became perilous, each journey a calculated risk. Yet in this frozen world, adaptation continued. Teams worked in concert to stabilize shelters, share body warmth, and hunt collectively, maximizing efficiency while minimizing exposure. Patience became as critical as strength. The land could not be rushed, and only those who understood its hidden patterns survived. In winter, the land itself was a trap, beautiful in its silent, sparkling stillness, deadly in its capacity to strike without warning. The Neanderthals learned anew that survival was a negotiation with the elements, a contest of foresight, endurance, and strategy. Every day was a test, every night a gamble, and every step across the frozen landscape carried the weight of life and death intertwined. Silence became a teacher, a language spoken in the rustle of leaves, the whisper of wind across rocks, and the faint impressions left in mud and snow. The Neanderthals learned to read the world with senses sharpened by necessity, to hear the subtle differences between the footfalls of deer and the stalking steps of a predator, to feel the tremor in the ground that hinted at an approaching storm or shifting earth. Every sound, every shadow, and every scent carried meaning. Knowledge of danger was not merely learned, it became woven into the rhythm of daily life, passed down quietly from elder to child, becoming the foundation of culture, of survival, and of respect for the land that offered both sustenance and peril. Tracking was no longer a simple pursuit of prey. Each footprint told a story. The depth of a hoof mark revealed size and weight, the angle of an impression indicated speed and direction, and the spacing between prints suggested whether the animal was alone or part of a herd. Observing these signs required patience and attention, an understanding that rushing or carelessness could result in wasted effort or deadly miscalculation. To follow without understanding was to court danger. Silence allowed Neanderthals to move undetected, to approach within striking distance, but it also allowed them to listen to the distant call of a bird, the snapping of a branch under a predator's paw, the subtle shifts in air temperature that hinted at weather changes or unstable terrain. Wind carried information and risk alike. A slight change in its direction could carry the scent of a hunter to a grazing herd or bring the smell of smoke and fire from a rival group. Observing wind patterns became a subtle art, a combination of intuition, experience, and observation. They learned to approach from downwind, to read the bending of grass and the ripple of water as indicators of direction and strength. Every gust could teach or betray, and those who listened carefully learned to anticipate what others missed. The land itself spoke, not in words, but in signs that demanded interpretation. Broken branches suggested predator movement, displaced stones indicated landslides or unstable ground, and subtle depressions in the earth hinted at hidden water or dangerous sinkholes. Every journey, every climb, every crossing became a lesson in attentiveness. Those who ignored these lessons faced injury or death. Those who mastered them gained the edge that ensured survival. Observation was both shield and sword, the way Neanderthals negotiated the precarious relationship with a world that was alive, shifting, and indifferent. Knowledge accumulated over generations became culture, codified not in symbols or language, but in practice, ritual, and expectation. Children were taught to move quietly, to watch, to listen, to respect the signs left by creatures both human and wild. The elders demonstrated how to interpret animal behavior, read the sky, and understand the subtleties of terrain. Each act of observation was reinforced through repetition, through careful imitation, and through the silent transmission of hard-earned lessons. Life and death were intertwined with knowledge, and the land, in turn, demanded humility and respect. By embracing silence, the Neanderthals learned not only to survive but to coexist with the land, to move within it without unnecessary conflict, to anticipate threats before they arrived, and to understand that wisdom often lay in what was not said. Silence was protection, observation was power, and knowledge became a legacy. In learning to listen, to watch, and to understand, they transformed danger into guidance, shaping a culture built upon the intimate and enduring conversation between human and environment, a dialogue that ensured the survival of their species across the perilous landscapes of prehistory. The first light of dawn stretched across frozen plains and snow-dusted forests, illuminating a world still indifferent, still dangerous, yet now tempered by experience. The Neanderthals, hardened by countless winters, countless hunts, countless encounters with the unpredictable land, stirred from their shelters, rubbing sleep from weary eyes and preparing for another day that demanded vigilance. The land remained a formidable teacher, every hill, river, and cliff carrying the memory of past mistakes, every crevice and hollow a reminder that survival was never guaranteed. Yet in their careful movements, in their thoughtful observation, in their knowledge of the terrain, the humans bore the marks not just of hardship, but of understanding. Memory had become as crucial as muscle. Every journey, every hunt, every river crossing carried lessons etched into minds and bodies alike. Paths through the forest were chosen not only for speed or convenience, but for safety, for opportunity, for the unseen threats revealed by past errors. Hunting strategies were informed by recollections of previous encounters, both successful and disastrous, allowing groups to anticipate the behavior of prey, to avoid the ambushes of predators, and to approach rivers, cliffs, and icy slopes with a cautious respect that had been honed over generations. The land had taught them that each step, each decision, carried weight, and the consequence of forgetting was immediate and often brutal. Survival had shaped intelligence, not in abstract thought alone, but in practical, adaptive reasoning. Groups learned to plan hunts collectively, to distribute labor, to recognize signals in wind, snow, and animal behavior that foretold danger. They observed patterns of seasons, predator migrations, and river flows, integrating this knowledge into a living map that guided movement and settlement. Even the youngest members of the group carried fragments of these lessons, taught through demonstration, imitation, and repetition. Every action became part of a broader memory, a cumulative record of trial, error, and insight. The land's perils had forged cooperation, communication, and foresight. Early humans moved together, sharing burdens and guarding one another, aware that isolation in such a world could be fatal. Shelters were chosen for strategic advantage, not just for warmth, and fire was tended carefully, providing light and protection but also serving as a signal, a marker of human presence in an otherwise indifferent wilderness. Knowledge of danger was encoded in ritual and habit: how to cross a river safely, how to store food, how to respond when a predator's spoor was detected. Every practice, every learned instinct, was a shield against the unpredictability of the world. Yet for all the danger, the land had also become a teacher of endurance, patience, and adaptation. Rivers might freeze and flood, slopes collapse, and storms rage. But the humans moved forward, guided by memory and by the accumulated wisdom of their ancestors. Each generation carried these lessons further, refining techniques, observing patterns, and passing knowledge along. The land remained as challenging as the sea had ever been, but humans had found ways to navigate, survive, and even flourish within it. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across ridges and valleys, the Neanderthals paused to observe, to remember, and to reflect. The land was still dangerous, but through experience and memory, they had begun to master a fragile equilibrium, balancing risk with opportunity, danger with necessity. In doing so, they forged the foundations of human intelligence, creativity, and resilience. The lessons learned in frost, in darkness, in the silent observation of riverbanks and cliff edges, shaped not only their survival, but the course of human history. What had once been a world where land was more perilous than the sea had become a landscape of understanding, a realm where caution, memory, and knowledge transformed the threats of nature into the architecture of survival, and where the dawn of each day offered both challenge and possibility.